Pieces together, and I want to round out some thoughts that I was introducing last week, trying to answer give a good answer and address an issue that we'll often rush past, which is, why should you pay attention to Jesus? Why should you pay attention to Jesus? Should you pay attention to Jesus? Because now I want this study to not only answer questions that you might be interested in, but I want to equip you so that you can say to the people around you, you can say to them, you ought to pay attention to Jesus. You ought to give Jesus an opportunity to speak to you. You ought to meet Him and get to know Him and find out if paying attention to Jesus might have some kind of transformational impact on your life. And so what we went over last week is, we have a world that thinks it's okay not to pay attention to Jesus. The Western world, the modern world, with a wave of the hand will say, he was a nice person with some nice ideas, interesting to some people, but what does someone who lived 2,000 years ago have to do with me? And what the robust answer that I want to give, and I want to equip you to give, is to say to them, He actually has everything to do with you. He's unavoidable. And since Jesus is the unavoidable person in the history of the world, you'll have to do business with Him. There's enough of a reason to do that because of His impact, because of the number of people who've been transformed by Him, because of the compelling nature of His truth, because of the personal testimony that you can give of what has happened to you because you've met this Jewish carpenter who died on a Roman cross 2,000 years ago, yet lives and is alive today and is actually alive in us. We have this story that we want to share and tell. The fact that our Western civilization really sits on top of the gospel, the priority of truth and the need to pursue truth that redeems things is really grounded in the reality of Christ. For all those reasons and many more, everyone must pay attention to Jesus. Everyone must pay attention to Jesus. And so the question of tonight then is, how do we pay attention to Jesus? So let me ask you, because I want there to be some audience participation time. Since Jesus is unavoidable, since every single person must pay attention to Him, at least give Him a chance. If in paying attention to Jesus, really meeting Jesus on His own terms, letting Him speak according to who He is, not according to some concoction that someone comes up with. We tend to want to try to shrink Jesus down or make Him a little more palatable, but I'm talking about just let Jesus loose. Just let Him be who He is and say what He wants to say. There may be people, there certainly are people who will really have a real engagement with Jesus and say, I'm just going to continue to be Lord of my own life. There are people like that. But what we find is, what the last 2,000 years have taught us, is that many people who will open their eyes to see Jesus find that a miracle happens. And so everyone needs to give Jesus a chance. And then the next question is, well, how do we pay attention to Jesus? How do you get to know Jesus? And so, audience, how do we get to know someone who lived and was on the earth 2,000 years ago? Okay, so we read the Bible. Somebody said, what else did you say? You read about Him? Okay, right?
See it in other people.
Okay, we certainly are reading the gospel in other people, but you've got it. One of the primary ways that we're going to meet Jesus in detail is by reading about Him. And we read about Him where? We read about Him in the Bible. What part of the Bible do we mainly read about Jesus? In the Gospels, right? The New Testament, the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are known as the Synoptic Gospels. There is your fancy schmancy word for the day. I didn't write it down here. Synoptic means seen together. If you're familiar with the Gospels, you know that if you read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you'll find that they are similar. Have y'all noticed that? That Matthew, Mark, and Luke are similar. Anybody know why they're so similar? I know they're talking about the same thing, but this is a theory in New Testament studies, I tend to adhere to it. But if you think another way, that's fine. It's called the priority of Mark. Almost all of Mark is in Luke and Matthew. Almost every verse, and pretty close to verbatim, Mark is in Matthew and Luke. Any guesses as to why you find almost all of Mark in Matthew and Luke?
He wrote it first.
Because Mark wrote it first, and Matthew and Luke had Mark. Luke especially says, I got my sources together. I had eyewitness accounts. I had the accounts of the people who first saw Jesus. And I think when Luke is saying that, he means one of those sources I had, because any good historian is just going to put together all of his books and stuff. And one of his books was Mark, all right? And so Mark was written early. It's the shortest. And Mark's favorite word is immediately. Mark loves to say immediately. And you get the sense Mark is writing this as fast as he can. Probably under persecution. The church is needing it, and he has quickly written it down. In fact, it's written in such a succinct manner, Mark doesn't write about the birth of Jesus. Mark starts at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, so he's in a hurry. And so Matthew and Luke, with different agendas in mind, they're seeking to fill in some of the gaps that Mark wasn't able to cover. John is a horse of a different color, all right? Either John did not have Matthew, Mark, and Luke, or he was familiar with it, but he had just decided he was going to take a completely different approach to Jesus' life. Lots of things are shared by all four Gospels, lots of stories, parables, events, and certainly the Passion of Christ, all of that. But John is a completely different, and probably was written last. John is written by a very old John. At the end of his life, probably in Ephesus, and he has spent his whole life thinking deeply about his time with Jesus and what Jesus taught and said. And so John has a bit more of a theological feel to it. And Matthew, Mark, and Luke are a little bit more episodic and action-packed. Yes, sir?
Didn't John leave the birth of Christ out of his scripture?
Well, John doesn't go back to start with the birth of Christ. Where does John start? At the birth of creation, right? So he goes all the way back. But right, he starts at Genesis 1, but then he zooms by the middle of the first chapter of John to begin talking about Jesus' ministry. So we have the four Gospels, and that's going to be the primary sources that we have for the life of Christ there, and they take the form of history. And so when Jesus followers say to people who are just beginning to check out Jesus, they'll say, well, to get to know Jesus, we're going to have to look at the history of Jesus. What might skeptical people say about the history of Jesus that we have? What are objections that people might raise to? It didn't really happen. That it's a legend. They say those things. Anything else come to your mind that people will say that source is not a good source for us to get to know Jesus? Say it louder.
Just a prophet like the rest of them.
Okay, he's no different than anybody else. Somebody else. Well, what do people have a problem with when they read the Gospels? What things specifically might they grumble at?
Not exactly the same.
Okay, there are differences between the Gospels. All right. The miracles. And I think that might be the top of the objection list, is things happen that we don't normally see happen. What are some of the miracles that people might object to? Water to wine. Raising somebody from the dead. Feeding the 5,000. And the list could go on and on. The Bible is full of miracles, so they are different from one another and supposedly then contradictory, filled with miracles. And so often the problem of Jesus is the problem of history, that Jesus really isn't a historical figure. So I want to tackle that real quickly if I can, just to equip you with some things to think about, because the only place for us to go to really get to know Jesus is the Gospels. That's our source. And if they are unreliable, if it is just a made-up myth, it was made up hundreds of years later, and it's not reliable, well, what if the Bible's unreliable? We're in trouble, I think, as somebody said. That's right. If the Bible is not reliable, we're in a fair amount of trouble when it comes to how to get to know Jesus. So here's what's not an option for us, is to say, the Bible is, take it or leave it. Nope. The Bible is authoritative. The Bible is a reliable source. And so when you talk to skeptical people how does it make you feel when someone says, well, the Bible's probably not true, or it's made up, it's a bunch of myths? How does that make you feel? That's right. Somebody's punching their fist out there, right?
Most of them probably never read it.
That's right. It pushes us back on our heels. We don't like to hear that. And frankly, I think if we're honest, most of us don't know a lot of people like that. Most of the people we know, even if they're not very committed Christ followers, they have a positive view of the Bible. They're not going to say anything like that. So when we hear somebody who says, well, I just don't think the Bible's true, we tend to back up a little bit. But here's one of the things I want to give you is you say, oh no, the Bible's totally true. The Bible's true. You make a great case for the truthfulness and the reliability of the Bible. The burden of proof is on the disbeliever, not on us. Okay? So let me give you a few things on that. And because I like doing this sort of thing, I like to dig underneath that question. Because one of the things to keep in mind now, and what's going on in our current cultural moment, our current philosophical moment, is the problem is as much the problem of history as it is the problem of Jesus. All right, now that's kind of a somewhat philosophical sounding statement, but we're coming to realize that figuring out what happened and why is a lot harder than you think. Do you agree with me? Let me see if I can make that case for you. But I'll get to that in a second. First of all, this idea, one of the things people say is that Jesus never existed. Have you heard that? People say, well, Jesus is just a made-up character. Here's in the interest of time tonight, no one who really understands anything about ancient history or the Bible thinks that. Even secular atheist scholars of ancient history say it is a dead certainty that there was a Jesus. Bart Ehrman, I've got that listed there. Bart Ehrman is an atheist. He's used to be a Christian. He's abandoned his faith in God. He is a historian of ancient history, and he wrote a book called "Did Jesus Exist?" So, "Did Jesus Exist?" is a book that was written by an atheist, and do you know what his answer is? Yes. Stop saying that Jesus didn't exist. You're making the rest of us look like idiots. All right, that Jesus absolutely existed. In fact, if Jesus didn't exist, then we don't know anything about anybody that lived before about 400 years ago. Because the evidence for Jesus' existence is stronger than the evidence for the existence of just about anybody else in ancient history. All right? It's that solid. So no one thinks that Jesus didn't exist. Jesus did exist. So if we know he existed and it's reliable that he existed, then the question starts to get more specific. Well, what about Jesus' existence that's recorded in history is reliable? Do we have to accept all of it, or can we accept bits and pieces of it? And so people will say things like, well, his teachings are good. The teachings of Jesus are good, but the rest of it doesn't work. Have any of you heard that? He was just a good teacher. They'll say good things about the Sermon on the Mount. Right? The Sermon on the Mount. Have you heard that? I can accept and believe the Sermon on the Mount. Yes or no? Y'all looking at me blankly. Yeah? Have you ever read the Sermon on the Mount? Like closely? Do you get to the end of reading on the Sermon on the Mount and say, refreshing. What a bunch of nice things. What do you think when you really read the Sermon on the Mount? What does it make you think about Jesus? I'm in trouble? Thank you. Yes, that's one of the things you ought to think when reading the Sermon on the Mount. Is this easy and nice? You read the Sermon on the Mount and you think easy and nice. What do you think? Demanding, hard, impossible, crushing, a whole new way. That this guy is making demands. It talks about judgment that's going to fall. Talks about the kingdom of God. Here's the deal. Only people, as Jack was saying, only people who've never read the Bible think that the teachings of Jesus are just these nice statements of niceness. From what's Jesus's the first words out of Jesus's mouth in Mark? It's what he's preaching. Repent. The kingdom of heaven is near. Judgment day is coming. And so there's way more to Jesus from the very beginning. And if you're going to meet any part of Jesus, you're going to recognize that he's just not some nice guy with some nice ideas. He is from beginning to end. He's saying something new has happened. And it's happening in me and through me. And you're going to have to make a decision about me. So if we're going to have anything to do with Jesus and we're going to admit that any part of his existence is historically reliable, that's the Jesus we're going to deal with. The one who's calling us to make a decision about whether he's Lord or not. C.S. Lewis's little way of thinking about it still holds true. He's either a liar, a lunatic, or Lord. Those are your three options. And if you want to try to make the case for lunatic or liar, let's get after it. Because it turns out that's a lot harder case to make than you think. And so, and then this problem of history. And I won't spend a lot of time on this, but I at least want you to think about it a little bit. It's the idea that there's something weak and doubtful or dubious about the history of Jesus, and the history that we have now is a lot more reliable. We can figure out what happened. Are we good at figuring out what happened?
No.
If you have little children and you walk into a room and the lamp has been busted and is on the ground, and you say to the eyewitnesses in there, "What happened?" What happens next? How many different stories do you get? How many kids do you have? Multiply that times 2. Right? And some of it is because they're not being honest. But a big part of that is it's different perspectives. There's different things that they bring to the table, a different set of presuppositions. We have a legal system, a jurisprudence system that is rooted in the idea of finding out, or we think finding out, what happened. Is it easy to find out what happened when a crime has been committed? No! Often juries even get it wrong. We've created this whole system to find out what happened. And really, we don't really want to the point is not finding out what happened. That can be endlessly discussed. For instance, if you're in a court case over a car collision, I could say, what happened? Well, some molecules were floating around. Woo, we're going to start there. What level of resolution do you start at? Or the moon was a rising gibbous, and we're going to start with the phase of the moon. You get my point? What resolution are we going to talk about when we try to start determining what happened? And that's not in the court of law. We're not really looking for what happened. What are we much more interested in? Why it happened. Why it happened. What's a big contributor to assigning guilt? Motive, intent. That's what you're really trying to find out. And is intent or motive purely a subject of historical investigation? I don't think so. There's a lot more going on. And there's no way, and see, what we've been up to is believing we could pry apart the facts and the values, the facts and the meaning. Or if you give us the facts, we can noodle out the meaning on our own. History just doesn't work that way. It's a much more complicated. And there are lots of things. I think back to all that unfolded after the killing of George Floyd. And we had video footage of it happening. And so since we had video footage of the event, everyone agreed about what happened. No, I mean, we almost blew the whole thing up. Because why it happened and what is the context around that and all the things that in which it was operating, it was enormously complicated. And all that means for us and for my point tonight is the having a story of what matters, having an idea of what's important and why it's important. Knowing that there's a deep plot that holds things together has to be acknowledged and dealt with, because here's the real deep question of history. Why do we pay attention to some things and ignore other things? If you're going to write a book on Abraham Lincoln, then you're not going to pay attention to George Washington. And so the question is, why pay attention to Abraham Lincoln instead of Eric Hankins? I think I said this last week. There's no histories of Eric Hankins right now. I'm so sad that that's the case. What makes us pay attention to some people, to some events, to some sequences? We haven't asked that question for a long time in our culture because we're a Judeo-Christian culture, and it was just agreed upon and assumed that there are some things that are more important than other things, good and evil and that sort of thing. And so as you've watched this Marxist takeover in our institutions, what happens to history when Marxists take over? What happens to history when Marxists take over? Doesn't matter. We can ignore everything that's happened up to this point because we already know everything we need to know. When we can find an oppressor and we can find an oppressed, don't give me any other information. I don't need it. It just gets in the way. And really all history is just this tool that oppressors use to hold on to power. It's often said if history is written by who? By the winners, right? And so that's how history is used. But that only holds true if there's this decision that there isn't any deep value structure, any deep plot of meaning that guides the way we think. And then here's the cool thing, and I promise I'll move on from this little philosophical rabbit trail. You can't make people not pay attention to certain things. They're just hungry to notice certain things. They're hungry to notice good and evil. They're hungry to notice heroism. They know instinctively that there's an up and a down and a right and a wrong and a good and an evil. They know that actions have consequences. They know that there are patterns of behavior that lead to life and patterns of behavior that lead to destruction. And they want to find out how that works. And you find out how that works by looking at history. And it's not just the history of stuff that happens. History is trying to notice the patterns of how the world works so that we don't die in it. And Jesus' story is the story that sits at the bottom of all those inquiries. That's why we're so interested in His history. So here's the cool thing about Jesus as we look at Him. Not only are we looking at the history of Jesus, but we're looking at the one who makes all of history possible. The one who makes truth possible is rooted and grounded in His life. So Jesus actually has a double interest. Not only is His history reliable, but His life makes knowing anything reliable because it's the foundation that sits on. I know those are some big ideas, but I at least want you contending with Him so that you can say to people, you can't ignore Jesus and you can't ignore the details of His story, because this incredible story, and I'll touch on some of this on Sunday as we start getting into the life of Luke, is Jesus shows up and He says, the way to live is to lay your life down for others. That makes no sense in the world that He shows up in. And yet it's the thing that everybody has been waiting to hear, even though they didn't know they were waiting to hear that. And it's the thing that sets people free and transforms the world. And because it's made possible through Him, then we need to learn and know of Him. And when you want to know somebody because you love them and are changed by them, then you want to know everything about them that you can possibly know. And the Bible is where we go to get that. So we can see Jesus and meet Him and know that what we find in the Bible is very reliable. And so let me speak to the specifics of the reliability of what we have in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and other places in the New Testament. Something cool happened. I think it was last week. Y'all familiar with the name Joe Rogan? Y'all know Joe Rogan? I think now between Spotify and YouTube, he has 30 million subscribers. 30 million. And about 11 million people listen to each one of his episodes of his podcast on Spotify. 11 million people at least will listen to those. I think when he interviewed President Trump, it was 30 million people listened to that podcast. Probably the single most important newscaster, honestly, in the world right now. This past week, he interviewed a guy named Wesley Huff. Wesley Huff is a Christian apologist. So you got Joe Rogan, who's moving towards Jesus. We got started with Joe Rogan. He hated Jesus, hated religion, thought it was dumb, made fun of it. He was a comedian. He would ridicule Christianity, and now he's starting to get very interested in it. And 11 million plus people listen to this young, very good Christian apologist lay out the reliability of Scripture to Joe Rogan for all the world to hear. Pretty cool, I thought. And this young man robustly challenged Joe Rogan, who is a real doubter in many ways and a real cynic, apprised him of the reliability of what we have in the New Testament. So let me hit a couple of highlights for you on that. One thing is called multiple attestation. When you have many different sources that are agreeing about something, that increases its level of reliability. The bottom line is there is more, Jesus' life is more multiply attested really than any other figure in history. Because not only do you have the four Gospels and then some other places in the New Testament, but you got the writings of Josephus, Tacitus, Suetonius, and a handful of others who speak about him. It's written very closely to when the events happened. You probably heard me share this before. I think the earliest, the closest writings having to do with Alexander the Great, there's about 400 years between the time Alexander the Great lived and the time the first writings that we have. 400 years. Yet I don't hear people saying, there's no such person as Alexander the Great. I'm an Alexander the Great denier. I just think that guy was made up. We do. It's a commonplace. What we have in terms of closeness is closer than figures like Julius Caesar. We have writings attesting to Jesus. Let me see if I can do it. So in 1 Corinthians 15, which was written in 55 AD, which is 25 years after the fact, you have Paul writing about the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. You have him in the book of Galatians. He starts to lay out the different years of where he, I was here, and then 10 years before that I had a vision and encounter with Jesus and that sort of thing. The bottom line is you can take the evidence that we have in the New Testament and you can get actual testifying in documents within a decade. Within a decade of it actually happening. That is totally unknown in ancient historiography. 10 years after the fact, you have people writing this stuff down and writing it like this. Jesus died, rose again, and He's God. What's tried to be foisted on us for the last couple of decades is the Roman Catholic Church made up the story of Jesus hundreds of years after it happened. That has never been true, and it is laughably wrong now. The Bible is extremely reliable. And then within the Gospels themselves, you have a characteristic called embarrassment. And that's what we talked about last week, the fact that women are the first witnesses. The fact that the heroes of the early church are the zeros of the gospel stories. They're the ones who deny and run away from Jesus. If it was made up, they wouldn't have written it that way. And it's something that I heard recently, and I'll move on to my next thing. In fact, I think it was Jordan Peterson who said this, who's come to believe in the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. He says, "Here are my choices. I can either believe that a bunch of peasants made up a story that has become the foundation of Western civilization, or I can believe that it actually happened. I can either believe that 12 semi-literate fishermen made up this thing that has given us Western civilization, or I can believe that it actually happened. Which requires more faith?" And then the New Testament scholar N.T. Wright says the best explanation for what we have in the Gospels and for the existence of the church 2,000 years ago, if you're intellectually honest, the best explanation for the Gospels and for the church is that Jesus rose again from the dead. That simply gives the best account of the evidence that we have. And so these scriptures, this history is reliable and gives us so much data that we can jump into, along with all the research and data around the writing of the New Testament, to really allow us to paint a detailed picture of this one who, if we'll meet Him, really does save and change everything. So that's what we're going to, with our time left, I'm going to start to lay out for you the world into which Jesus was born, and that's what's on your notes. All right? It's common among people who didn't get the chance to go to seminary to think the Old Testament ends and the New Testament begins the next year. That is not how that works. And so, how many years, this is your bonus trivia question, how many years between the close of the Old Testament and the opening of the New Testament? 400 years. So another assumption is, well, during those 400 years, and you'll hear people say, God stopped talking, and He did, because we don't have authoritative scripture during that time period. But the wrong inference is nothing happened during those 400 years. Well, let me tell you what I know about people. There's never nothing happening with people. And so that's certainly the case. It's called the intertestamental period, very creatively called the intertestamental period, but there's a lot going on. In fact, if you don't know what happened in the 400 years between the Old Testament and the New, you're going to struggle to grasp what's going on in the story of Jesus. And so, because I know you love this kind of history, I'm going to give you a crash course in those what happened between the Old Testament and the New, with an eye of why this matters about understanding Jesus. Okay, y'all ready? You got caffeine flowing through your veins? All right. Let's see if we can knock it out in the time that I have left. Here's the thing to know. Even for the intertestamental period, maybe the most important thing to know as it pertains to the dynamic in the Gospels, is that while the people had been able to return from the Babylonian exile, the sense was the exile had never really ended. And so the people of Jesus' day still feel like they're still in exile. And that is a important thing to know. Staple that to the fact that that's a very Jewish idea. One of the things that happened in New Testament scholarship over a couple of centuries, probably has a little bit of an anti-Semitic basis to it, is the Jewishness of Jesus got lost. We tended to think of what Jesus has done is he was born and He said, forget about Judaism, I'm doing something completely new. That's not, you'll misunderstand Jesus if you do that. Jesus is a Jew. He was born a Jew. He died a Jew. He is a Jew at the right hand of the Father right now. He's so Jewish. All right. So, and of course, the story of what God is up to in Israel is the story of what God is doing in the world. And so you have to know that whole story. But this idea that the exile had never really ended. And so this desire for the exile to truly come to a conclusion, for them to really come out of slavery and come into the land of promise and experience to experience the fulfillment of all that God had promised. That's what an ordinary Jew of Jesus' day, that was just sort of the operational idea that was going on. And so it gives you two big questions. When? How long, O Lord? When will this exile truly come to an end? We're waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting. Will it ever come? And you got a spectrum of people. You got the Sadducees, basically, who are going to say, quit waiting, it's never going to come. All right? God was probably talking symbolically about something else, and so forget that. All the way to the Zealots, who are like, it's coming in 30 minutes. And if we'll stab everybody in the neck, that'll get that going. So, I mean, forget everything else. We got to be making the return of Yahweh to His land. There isn't anything else even worth thinking about. All right, but you've got that dynamic going on. When is it going to happen? And when it happens, who will be? And the word they liked was justified. And so when Paul talks about justification, we tend to make justification a very personal thing. And it is. It has that dynamic. What does it mean for me to be made right before God? That's right. But in the Jewish mind, when they heard justification and talked about that, they were thinking about the last day, the great judgment, the day of the Lord. When God comes back, and what's one of the big things God's going to do when He comes back? He is going to evaluate. He is going to judge. And what's that judgment going to lead to? What'll come after that judgment? Heaven or hell. That's right. Sheep and goats, right and left. And one group goes one direction, one group goes another direction. One group's in and one group's out. And so the big question, when Yahweh returns and He judges, who will stand in the judgment? And again, that's what they meant by saved. We tend to make it very individualistic. How I can be forgiven of my sins so I can go to heaven when I die. And that's in there. But for a Jew, they were thinking judgment day. Who will be able to stand at the judgment, and who will fall on judgment day? And this is the question. And this is what's being debated. Who's going to be in and who's going to be out? And how can you tell? And so the symbols, and that's the other thing we're going to watch Jesus do. All prophets paid attention to the symbols, and the symbols that helped identify Jewish life and Jewish identity seemed to be very apparent and something that was closely paid attention to. So the first symbol was being in the land. What is the land? Who should be in the land? Who's not in the land? Who was in the land in Jesus' day that shouldn't have been there? The Romans, all right? And so we know we're in exile right now because we are not ruling over our land. And we're going to talk about the series of people who were in charge of the Holy Land. But because their land was pervaded with infidels and pagans and idolaters, and the people were friends with them and eating with them and that sort of thing. Or you're a tax collector, and so you're dealing with and touching with these pagans who are in our land. It keeps the land defiled, and as long as the land is defiled, Yahweh won't come back. And so there's just this whole issue of land. We sometimes will think, big deal. Wow. When you made a trip from Galilee to Jerusalem, what would get in the way of that trip and make it longer? Do you remember? Samaria. And what would a righteous Jew, a Torah-following Jew, have to do? Walk all the way around it. Maybe 50 or 60 miles out of the way, walking. People like us, it doesn't matter. It mattered to them. All right, they didn't want their feet to touch it because then they'd be defiled. And so land is important. Temple. So huge discussion of the temple. We'll talk about this in a little bit, but under Herod, and Herod is Herod the Great, is ruling when Jesus is born, and he had greatly expanded the temple. It was one of the wonders of the ancient world. Beautiful, gleaming limestone, unbelievable. But people had a problem with the temple still. What was the problem with the temple?
Why wasn't it?
They did not have a story of the Shekinah glory of God coming like it had come to the first temple under Solomon's leadership. And Herod, we'll get to this too, wasn't really a Jew, wasn't really a good guy, didn't follow the Torah, didn't worship God alone, and he was kind of in charge of that area. And so we're in the land, but the land is filled with Romans. We have our temple, but God's not there. What else was missing from the temple? What was behind that curtain? Nothing. The Babylonians had carried off the Ark of the Covenant. And there's absolutely no story and I think it was one of the Roman generals actually went in and went back there and was shocked to find nothing. They would, Day of Atonement, they would take the blood of the bull and go in there and sling it around because that's what the rule said, but they weren't slinging it onto anything, and everyone knew it. It really did have that Wizard of Oz feel. Oh, look at the man behind the curtain, Remember that part? And so it did not have the ring of truth to it. Does this really work? The priesthood, all right? We're going to learn that the priesthood's going. Was there a high priest in Jesus' day? Was there a high priest in Jesus' story? Well, it's where they worked out how to kill him. But the high priests weren't Aaronic high priests. They were Levites, but they weren't Aaronic, and the high priest was to be from Aaron's clan, Aaron's group within the Levites. So those are the guys that are in charge. They're supposed to be the priests. These are the guys who are high priests and doing all the things in the temple there, but not really qualified. Torah. What is the Torah? Sadducees only followed the first 5 books. Pharisees followed all of what we would consider to be the Old Testament. What's authoritative? What's not authoritative? And what does it mean to follow Torah? What the Pharisees had done. Remember, how many laws had the Pharisees come up with? You remember? 613, I think is the number. 613 laws. Laws about toast. Law, you can only walk so far, right? Which are not laws that are in the Old Testament, but they had decided to create a fence around the law, so you never even got close to abrogating it. If you go to Jerusalem now, there is the Sabbath elevator, and on Sabbath day, the Sabbath elevator only it goes up 1 floor at a time, and the doors open and close at every floor. Why? Because if you mash that button, it makes a little electronic signal. Tell the elevator what floor you want to go to, and that's kindling a fire on the Sabbath. And so to keep from kindling a fire on the Sabbath, you got to get in the Sabbath elevator on Sabbath day, and it lets you go up and down without ever having to mash one of those buttons. Take you all day to go up and down but there are Orthodox Jews with the ringlets and that kind of thing. They'll fight you if you try to put them in a non-Sabbath elevator on the Sabbath day. Where does all that come from? That comes from this time period. But why? And you think, well, who cares? But for these people, who will stand on the day of judgment, and how can you tell? For Pharisees, it was those who are following Torah. Those who are following Torah. And if enough Jews will follow Torah at the same time, our God will come back. So it's very important. That's what He said He wants, and so we're going to do it. What is the Torah, and what does it mean to be a Torah people? Who is the king? Who's the king, right? At this time, who was the king when Jesus was born? Herod. Rome had declared him. Rome had declared him the king of the Jews. Hooray, everybody said. We have a king in Israel. Is that what everybody thought about King Herod? No. The Romans don't tell us who our king is. That makes him not king. And then Herod wasn't even really a Jew. So they're looking for a king. They want a king. One of the high priests that I'll get to had declared himself king, but he was not from the Davidic line. Can't be king. And so it's this sense. And then finally, the people themselves. The Pharisees called ordinary Jews the Am Haaretz, the people of the land, the rabble, the scrubs, the nobodies. This group of people, peasants, 90% of the people in the Roman Empire, and certainly 90% of the people in Israel were peasants. What that meant was every day, the question of the day was, will I get enough calories today? Every day was the day, will I die today of this boil that's on my arm that I can't get fixed? Every day, the question was, will my infant child live today? Every day, will some group come riding over the hill outside of my home and take what I own? Will the Romans show up to collect the taxes that I can't pay? And they lived in the grind of every day and did not have time for Torah following and measuring out how far they had walked and all that sort of stuff. And so, because they couldn't follow the law the right way, they weren't the kind of people that God would return and get. They were the riffraff. And if they would just straighten up, things would change, and it was their fault. So all of this is the dynamic, and all of that had merged out of this intertestamental period. And then you have what I have there is what then is the response. And the response is on a spectrum from the Herodians. There were Herodian Jews who said, let's throw in our lot with the Romans. Let's just do like Herod. Man, you've got to make it work with these people. Judaism, man, that has seen its better day, and we just don't need to bother with that anymore. You had Jews like that, and all the way to the other end of the spectrum, the Essenes was a group that had left Jerusalem. They had rebuilt their own colony down by the Dead Sea, and every day they would look to see if today was the day that the fire of heaven would fall and destroy Jerusalem. Their deal was, we don't need to abandon Judaism, we need to abandon Jerusalem. That thing has had it. It's a mess. The only thing left for it is destruction, and God will establish a new temple. He'll send a new temple out of the sky, and He'll start over with a new group of people. So all that dynamic is going on. So how are we to understand it? Let me give you this crash course, and I'm going to try to do it in 20 minutes. We'll see how that goes. So first of all, just so you know it, Israel, the land of Israel, is very small. We spend a lot of our lives as Christians inhabiting the land of Israel as we read the Scripture, and it seems big to us, but it is 150 miles long and 75 miles wide. That means it's about the size of Vermont. All right, it's a small place. You can, on a sunny day, you can stand at the precipice of the Mount of Olives and see the Dead Sea. So you can look and see the Dead Sea. That's from Jerusalem. You can go just outside of Jerusalem to the west, and you can see the Mediterranean almost from Jerusalem. You can see the Mediterranean Sea. You can stand on top of Mount Carmel and see Nazareth from the top of Mount Carmel. You go to the Sea of Galilee, it's a lake. You can see across it anywhere you stand. You can see the other side. And it wouldn't take much energy to get in a boat and paddle your way across it. It's a small place. Yet it is the axis mundi, the center of the world. It was certainly the geographical center of the known world of that time. Egypt to the south, the Persians and the Parthians and all those to the east, Greece to the north. It was really the crossroads and the center point of the whole world at the time. And so, even though small, it was extremely important. And it's not that way today, is it? It's crazy how that little postage stamp of a place still has the attention of the whole world. 2,000 years later, same deal. Don't try to tell me there is no God operating and in charge of the history of the world. So then what happened between the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New? The first group to rule over the land of Israel as the Old Testament was closing was the Babylonians. In 587, they destroyed the temple. Some of the language I'm going to use moving forward is First Temple and Second Temple Judaism. Second Temple Judaism is the Judaism of Jesus' day, and it's called Second Temple Judaism because they're in the temple that got started to be built after the Jews started to return after the Babylonian deportation. But when the Babylonians destroyed that first temple, they pulled it completely down. And so the foundations had to be relaid when they started building that second temple. All right? There were multiple deportations that conclude with the destruction in 587. The people are carried off. A few folks were left behind, and they intermarried with Babylonians who'd been put in there, and other folks, and those folks became Samaritans. And the temple was totally destroyed. And here's one of the things I want you to catch. The destruction of that first temple was the end of the world. It was the end of the world. How could God let this happen? And here's what the exile would teach the Jews, because you got two choices. This is always it's always the two options you have after something devastating happens to you. Either there is no God, or God's completely in charge of everything. Even the hard things that I don't understand, right? And so the Jews go off to Babylon, and the reason they went off to Babylon is because they could not make up their mind about God. They wanted to keep their options open. But man, when they come back after the exile, they believe there's only one God. They've had to settle that issue. There's only one God, and He's in charge of the movement of all the nations. He's just not the God in Israel. He's the God. He's God everywhere. So monotheism is a huge part. There is only one God. And that happens because of the Babylonians. So in 540, Cyrus the Great comes on the scene. He's prophesied by Isaiah and others by name. And Cyrus, who is a Persian, comes onto the scene and defeats Babylon, invades and takes over, and he, in that process, becomes the emperor over the region of the Holy Land. And the thing about Cyrus, what's noteworthy about Cyrus when it comes to Israel and the Jews? Lets the Jews go home. He lets them start going back from 537 to 515. The people go back and they start to rebuild the second temple. All right? Which is a stunning act of mercy and grace, and also a stunning keeping of God's promise. Then the Medo-Persians are replaced in 336 by the Greeks. So you really have the emergence of people from the West. I think Alexander is only 30 years old, and he is taking over the whole world. But he dies at a young age, and he leaves 4 generals in charge, and that'll be important in just a second. But one of the things that Alexander the Great brings that's new is he has a vision of one world. It's called Hellenism. And so, different from other conquerors, he came not only to take over land, to get slaves, and to get money, but he actually intended for these conquered places to become Hellenized. He wanted them to learn his language. He wanted them to take on his values. And he believed that he was saving the world. It wasn't just merely power and control, but he viewed the rest of the world as barbarians, as living the wrong way, ignorant and lost in darkness. And so he was going to come and bring philosophy and enlightenment and this new and better language, and he was going to convert the world to Hellenism. All right? Up to that point, invaders really didn't care what you believed. They might even just say, well, tell me about your gods. And they describe the dragon god and the god of war and their god of the sky. And the conquerors would say, well, we got one of those gods. Will you just use his name in your temple? Sure, fine. And everybody would just keep on doing what they were doing. But what becomes different is the Greeks want you to worship like they worship and think like they think and talk like they talk. And they want you to stop doing this other, what they would consider to be barbaric, backward kind of religiosity. All right? That'll be important in just a second. So Alexander comes bringing Hellenism. And this begins to, when this influence touches Israel, you're going to hear about Hellenizers. All right? There's always going to be groups of Jews who want to accommodate with the culture. Let's just learn their language. Let's accept their gods. Let's accept their dress and their styles, their hairstyles. Let's become more Jewish. We'll get along with them, then they'll treat us well. Okay? So the Greeks are there, or the Greeks invade, and then Alexander dies, and he breaks the Greek Empire into four big pieces. And one is right at Israel is a border, and to the north it's the Seleucids, and to the south down to Egypt it's the Ptolemies. I'll go through that real quickly. The first group to rule over the land of Israel is the Ptolemies. They rule from Egypt, and they allow the high priest to remain. That's the high priest continuing to function is a deal you need to be paying attention to. So they're okay. Even though they want some Greek laws to be followed, the Jews are so insistent about their way of worshiping and their temple that they insist on a high priest. And the Ptolemies, which are southern Egyptian Greeks, let them allow their high priest to remain. But this dynamic will start in Israel between the Hellenizers, which are people who say, let's just get along with the Greeks, and the Hasidim. This is this first group that will lead to the Pharisees of saying, do not compromise with the Greeks. We're not going to speak their language. We're not going to accept their rules. We're not going to change our diet. We're not going to eat what they eat. We're not going to hang out with them. They're a part of the pagan nations. We'll have nothing to do with them. And so this is where this tension begins between, do we accommodate or do we remain walled off in order to be real Jews? Okay? So the Ptolemies rule from 320 to 198, and then the power flips and the Seleucids start to rule. These are the people who are up in Syria. Their kings or rulers, not kings, but the rulers over the Seleucid Empire are Antiochus. Y'all remember the name Antiochus? Does that mean anything to anybody? You'll learn about Antiochus Epiphanes. It's where we get the word Antioch. The Antiochenes were ruled over by Antiochus, and Antioch is in Syria. Okay, so think of now, instead of being ruled from the south, Israel is being ruled by Greeks from the north. And these Greeks from the north are not nice like the Ptolemies. They're mean. Antiochus' desire is to turn these stiff-necked Jews into good Greeks. So, and really the man who really seeks to enforce that is Antiochus IV, or Antiochus Epiphanes. Epiphanes means God manifest. Do you think Antiochus thought well of himself? His nickname, his throne name is God Manifest. All right? So, Antiochus Epiphanes the Hasidim had their high priest in place. And a Hellenizer guy wants to get that high priest job, so he bribes Antiochus Epiphanes to let him become the high priest. And because Epiphanes thinks he's in charge of everything, he just replaces the high priest of the Jews with a Hellenizer. This does not make Jews happy, all right? And in 168, Antiochus goes down to Egypt and he loses this huge battle. And so he's really mad that he's losing control of Egypt. And a rumor gets started in Israel or in Judea that he got killed in the battle. And so the old Hasidim high priest, the true or Orthodox high priest, throws the new high priest out, runs him off. Well, Antiochus is on the way back to Antioch from Egypt, and he stops by Jerusalem to see how things are going and finds out that his high priest has been kicked out. Well, he's mad because he's lost, and he thinks it's the Jews' fault that he lost the battle. And he's mad that his high priest has been replaced, and so he throws a fit. And this is going to be where the abomination of desolation occurs that Daniel talks about. All right, y'all familiar with that? So in 168, he slaughters tens of thousands of Jews. He just kills them. He restores his high priest, who's an illegitimate high priest. And he commits the abomination of desolation, which is this. He sacrifices a pig on the altar in the temple. How do you think that went over? All right, so imagine where this place, where for centuries, lambs and bulls have been sacrificed to the one true living God, and he goes in and sacrifices a pig on that altar, takes the blood of that sacrifice and sprinkles it on scrolls of the Torah. So he's got pig blood, sprinkles it all over their sacred writings. Makes the priest eat pork. He just holds them down and forces the pork into their mouth, and then puts out the lamp in the temple, the menorah that's shining there. When is the menorah shining in the temple? Always. It never goes out. Okay, that's the rule. It never goes out. He puts that thing out. And that was a bridge too far. So you have what's called the Maccabean Revolt. There's a priest named Mattathias. He's in an area that's somewhat near Jerusalem. A Syrian comes along and he gets a Jew to make a pagan sacrifice. Probably gets a Jew to sacrifice a pig to eat it. And Mattathias is the first guy that says, no. And so he kills the Syrian and he kills the Jew that had committed the apostasy. A revolt breaks out. Thousands of Jews follow Mattathias into the hills, and the battle is on. Mattathias is an old guy, and he doesn't live very much long after this. And his son Judas Maccabeus. Y'all heard of the Maccabean Revolt? Anybody heard of the Maccabean? Okay. Maccabeus means hammer, and Judas the Hammer. He really becomes the leader of this group of guerrilla rebels. And over the next years, they will fight their way back in Jerusalem. They'll take Jerusalem back over. They'll purify the temple and light the menorah. And then there's this miracle of the menorah shining. I think it's for 8 nights without the proper oil being there. And that's where the celebration of Hanukkah comes from, all right? So Hanukkah comes from the intertestamental period, all right? This great celebration of Jewish independence, okay? And so, and that happens in basically from 168 to 166. The battle is going on, but the I think it's 165 that the temple is purified, that Hanukkah happens, and that Jewish self-determination, at least in Jerusalem, and then radiating out from there, begins to be established. So, now, the family name of Mattathias and Judas the Maccabeans is the Hasmoneans. If you read about this, you'll read about the Hasmonean dynasty. And so, during this period of Jewish independence, the Hasmoneans are going to be the high priests. All right, they're going to come from this same family line. And they rule from 165 BC to 63 BC. For about 100 years, 60 years before Jesus is born, for 100 years, the Jews enjoy independence. Now, how many of you remember something that happened 60 years ago? Do any of you all in this room, is there anybody in here who remembers something from 60 years ago? Come on. Raise your hand. There's one courageous brother, all right? There are people in here who remember things from 60 years ago. Here's the point. There were many, many people in Jesus' days who remembered when they had independence. They remembered when the Romans were not in charge, the Greeks were not in charge, the Babylonians were not in charge, the Persians were not in charge. We were in charge of it ourselves. And they cherished that memory. They cherished the return to that. They didn't think that was some far-fetched, long-away idea. They knew that it could happen. They were children during that time period. And so their hope was strong that it could happen again. They really did believe if the right leader came along, the right Mattathias, the right Judas Maccabeus, the right ruler, if he would step up, they really could kick the Romans out just like we kicked the Greeks out a generation or two before. Okay? So the Hasmoneans rule. They are the non-Aaronic progeny of Mattathias, and they rule as high priests. What's the problem then with this high priesthood of the Hasmoneans? Not really qualified to be high priests. So it's great that we got Jewish high priests and we're independent, but there's this little secret nagging problem. They achieved total independence from Syria. That's the Greek what the Greek rule had become under Simon, who's in this same family line, the Hasmoneans, in 142. Then on down from there was a guy named John Hyrcanus. He's part of these Hasmoneans as well. He's so powerful that he wants to be king, not only the high priest, but he wants to be the king as well. But not only is he not Aaronic, but he's not Davidic. He's in the tribe of Levi, not in the tribe of David. So he wants to be king, and on one hand, the Jews want a king, somebody to really rule and take care of them. But what's the problem? Not really qualified to be the king. So there's tension there. Because of that, he is opposed by a group that emerges during this time period called the Pharisees. They come out of this Hasidim, which means holy, and Pharisees means separate. We want to be separated from anything that is not consistent with what the Torah calls us to do. So he is opposed. John Hyrcanus is opposed by the Pharisees. He's supported by the Sadducees. So this is when the Pharisees and Sadducees emerge, is under this time of independence under John Hyrcanus. And the Sadducees, which means the righteous ones, that's kind of a nice thing to name yourself. They only believe in the first 5 books of Torah, and they are ones who say we really ought to try to compromise and accommodate with what the rulers want. So this goes on for 100 years, from 165 to 63, and then the Romans show up in 63. The Romans had been in the process up to this point. This is during the time of Julius Caesar. They're expanding in every direction. And they finally wind up at the border of Israel. And really there's not much of a fight. Pompey comes in and just takes over, basically. I think it was Legion X that was there with him. And Pompey conquers Syria. He defeats a king, Aristobulus II, which he's another one of these Hasmonean high priest / king types. And he puts a man named Antipater in charge of Israel. He's the procurator, I never can say these words right, of the province of Judea. Antipater, the Idumean, is Herod's dad. So that's how Herod is going to come on the scene, as Herod's dad. Once the Romans get in charge, they need to put a local ruler in. They put in Antipater, and he is put in power by Julius Caesar. So, isn't that interesting of note? So Herod's dad is put in place by Julius Caesar. And then Herod, Antipater's son, becomes the king of the Jews in 40 AD. There's a bunch of assassinations and who's going to be the emperor of Rome. And Herod was the master of being able to always land on the right side. He just had a sixth sense for who was going to win and how to be on the team of whoever wins. And so he gets named as the king of the Jews. That happens in Rome. And he goes back to receive his kingdom. One of the things we're going to look at as we look at the life of Christ is Jesus talks a lot about a person who leaves the country and comes back to receive a kingdom. Y'all remember that in the text? And that's got a Herodian echo to it. So Herod comes back to announce to everybody, guess who's in charge now? It's me. And the response of the Jews was, they weren't too excited about that. So, the Romans are in charge. The Romans bring order, peace. They bring roads. They bring a universal law. They bring a lot of security, and that's the upside. The downside of the Romans is it is peace with the edge of a sword. And so they were brutal rulers. They would crush dissent, and they wanted you to get in line. But as long as there was no trouble, they tended to let you do whatever they want. So they leave the high priest in place, And if that just keeps everybody settled, that'll be fine. They do build the Antonia Fortress is on the corner of the Second Temple there. I think Herod is part of that construction. And so that the Romans, it's a Roman fortress, that's the corner of the temple court, so the Romans can look down and watch what was going on inside of the temple courts when the Jews were doing sacrifices and going in and out. How much do you think the Jews liked that? There were pagan Romans in the temple precinct watching what they were doing. And from time to time they would go in there and slaughter a bunch of them. So it's not a happy relationship. And so tremendous tension with the Romans. Rome liked Judea because it was a buffer against the Parthians, who were always a source of difficulty for the Jews. It was a source of corn. So it was fairly important. They wanted to have good rulers there. They also wanted to have a very tight rule and tight control of that area, even more so because the Jews were such a difficult group of people to rule. They didn't do very good at submitting. So they allowed the Jews to practice their faith, to keep the temple, and to have a high priest. And that keeps things at a low boil. Herod, when Jesus is born, so here's a little deal. It looks like now that Jesus was probably born in 4 BC. And that's the guy who originally came up with the calendar was missing some tidbits of information about when Herod actually died. And so Herod, I think, died in 6 BC. No, Herod died in 4 BC. And so Jesus couldn't have been born after Herod died. So that has nothing to do with the authority of Scripture. Sometimes when I tell people it looks like Jesus was born in 4 BC, they freak out. The whole AD BC thing is wonderful because that's how we ought to divide the calendar, but it's no big deal that time is a little lumpy in the middle. That I think it was a Roman Catholic monk who put it all together. He did the best he could with what he had. But Herod married a Hasmonean princess, so he found a Mariamne, I think was her name. Now, I think he had to steal her or kill her husband or something. But anyway, he got him a Hasmonean wife, even though he hated the Hasmoneans. And he ends up killing her and killing her sons because he was a nut. But all the time, Herod is trying to demonstrate that he is the legitimate king. Everything you see in Israel that's old, Herod built. I mean, from far north to Masada in the south, everything that's still there was built by Herod. That cat could build good stuff. There's a huge aqueduct. If you go to the city of Caesarea Maritima, it's still there. Herod learned to pour a form of early concrete and actually had a concrete harbor poured there at Caesarea Maritima, and then this huge aqueduct that came into Caesarea Maritima. Unbelievable administrator, savvy politician, but he wasn't the true king. And so when those wise men show up and they say, we're looking for the king of the Jews, Herod knew they didn't mean him. And it made him terribly angry to hear that. So he was cruel and unstable as he got older. So, as I conclude, this is the milieu into which Jesus is born. As all time periods are, tremendous tension, groups of people vying for power, a longing and a hope in the midst of hopelessness among the ordinary people. A great life was very tenditious. It was deeply uncertain. But one thing was clear, people were waiting for God to come back. They were waiting for their God to come home, to come back to the place where his throne was. And so there was a universal longing for something to happen. Now we're going to talk some about Messiah because Messiah figured into that in some different ways. But even if some of the Jews of the day weren't waiting for the Messiah, they were all waiting desperately for something to happen. Let me edit that. except for the people who were making lots of money off the status quo, they were fine with how things were. But everybody else knew that something was going to have to change. And they were desperate to find out who, and they were desperate to know, would they be on his side when he showed up. And so that's the world into which Jesus is born. And knowing that helps you to understand how Jesus both is related to, yet utterly explodes all those expectations. So that they were looking for him and they weren't looking for him at the same time. Something that we sometimes can do as well. Well, thank you. This is going to be the most history you're going to do in one chunk. All right. For those of you who hated history in school and wished it was over, it goes up from here, and we'll do a lot more Jesus stuff moving forward. But Jesus didn't drop out of the sky with no context. And if you know more about what's going on, you'll have a better understanding of the things that we will watch him say and do as he starts to do his ministry. But let's pray, and I'll let you get going. God, we love you. We thank you for sending Jesus. We thank you that at the same time that it looked like we were making an absolute mess of everything, it was also the fullness of the time. In one ways, it was the wrong time for you to send your Savior, and at the exact same time, it was perfect. It was perfect. People spoke the same language, and they were connected far and wide. And even though it was very dark, even the depth of the darkness made the light of salvation shine even brighter. And so, God, we remember that you are always on time. You're always accomplishing your purposes, yet you are always 1,000,000 times more than anything we could ever anticipate. And so, help us to learn through this process to just let Jesus be Jesus. I ask this in his name. Amen.